Where are you from is surely a question that just about everyone has been asked. You could have been a tourist in a faraway land, or right next door in Trump land, or at a cosmopolitan welcome event for foreign students. In one of my first encounters with that question on a field trip to Indonesia, my response that I was Canadian was met with a dismissive reply. "You look Mexican." It was an entirely friendly encounter in a country as diverse as Canada, if not more so. But I'd been firmly classified as really from the global south, which is not far off the mark at all, since I was born in East Africa, the child of South Asian migrants. For my Indonesian interlocutor, though, identity was what Amartya Sen calls a singular thing. Pluralist identities were just masks. A few weeks ago, as some of you may have noted, Bernardine Evaristo, co-winner with Margaret Atwood of the 2020 Booker Prize, was asked on BBC Hard Talk about this, when one is, like her and our guest today, a mix of ethnicities. In her case, with a white British mother and a Nigerian father. Evaristo dismissed the idea of choosing an identity. Society, she said, makes that choice for you. Quote, "I would have to wear a sign saying I am white," she retorted, "and see how far that gets you." Evaristo also dismissed the idea that being black was somehow limiting, because there are far more brown and black people in the world than white. But what does this say about a world where we have constantly to navigate this? Because if we can get away with another identity, if we can pass, then it would make life easier. In COVID-19 terms, we seem to be looking for PPE, personal protection equipment against prejudice. Washing your hands frequently won't do the trick, though we do have skin creams and soaps that are advertised along those lines. In her 2020 Clark Lecture in English Literature at Trinity College, Cambridge, the Indian writer Arundhati Roy argued that navigating identities is done especially usefully in imaginative fiction. Why? Because, she says, fiction has the capaciousness, the freedom and latitude to hold out a universe of infinite complexity. Because every human is really a walking sheaf of identities, a Russian doll that contains identities within identities, each of which can be shuffled around. Which is a perfect segue to our guest today. When David Chariandy's book, Brother, was a CBC Canada Reads 2019 choice, he said, "I'm honestly not sure how my literature fits into the Canadian canon. I write pieces about places here and there in Canada, on these Indigenous lands, but I know that my literature also connects to the Caribbean and to the Black world, and to other places as well. Well, I suggest it's the Canadian canon that has to adapt to David's writing, which is not to say that his work is not global in scope. But isn't that also true about the Canadian canon itself, or should be? Welcome, David.
Welcome. Well, thank you very much. Welcome to everyone listening. It's a great honor to be listened to on such a beautiful day here in Vancouver. And it's a pleasure being here. And thanks to Mark and all of the others involved in organizing this as well.
Well, it's brilliant to have you. David, your latest book, I've been meaning to tell you, that's the one in the middle of the screen here, has a rich lineage. James Baldwin wrote a letter to his nephew. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a letter to his son. Could you read from the beginning of the book, featuring your daughter at age 9, to give us a sense of it?
Yes, of course. Yeah, so I'll read from the very beginning. It's set where I am now. I called it Vancouver just a moment ago. It's also the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam peoples. And I'll just read from the beginning. Once, when you were 3, we made a trip out for lunch. We bussed west in our city to one of those grocery store buffets serving the type of food my own parents would scorn. Those overpriced organics laid out thinly in brushed steel trays. The glass sneeze guard just high enough for you, dearest daughter, to dip your head beneath it in assessing suspiciously the browned rice and free-range carrots. And in that moment, I could imagine myself a father long beyond the grip of history, and now caring for his loved one through kale and quinoa and a soda boasting real cane sugar. But we're both dessert people. A soda won't cut it, and so we shared a big piece of chocolate cake. It's good for you, you giggled. Chocolate cake is very, very good for you. You squirmed away as I tried to wipe your mouth, laughing at all of my best efforts. It was an ordinary moment, and an ordinary thirst was brought on by the thick sweet of the cake. And so I stood and moved toward a nearby tap to get us both a glass of water, encountering a woman on her way to do the same thing. She was nicely dressed, a light summer cream suit, little makeup, tasteful. We reached the tap at roughly the same time. I hesitated out of politeness, and this gesture seemed only to irritate her. She shouldered herself in front of me, and when filling her glass of water, she half turned to explain, I was born here. I belong here. Her voice was loud. She meant to be overheard, to provoke agreement maybe, though the people lunching around us reacted only by focusing harder upon their own bowls and plates. And you, my daughter, sitting closest, didn't understand, or else you didn't even hear. You were still in a moment of joy, your own laughter filling your ears, the dark frosting between your teeth. And so I decided. I waited patiently to fill our glasses. I walked carefully back to you, never spilling a drop. I sat. I might have tried to match your smile. I might have attempted to once more to wipe your mouth, or asked you to take a sip of water to prevent dehydration, the latest foolish fear of parents like me. I don't remember. I sometimes find myself in this state during the course of an ordinary day. I was lost in thought and quiet, even after I caught your hand waving before my eyes, your face now cross and confused. Hey, you asked, what happened?
Thank you, David. Belonging here, David, is about history, or as you put it in a recent interview with The Guardian, the past is not yet past. When things happen, the only way we can make sense of it is by telling the story about the past, realizing where prejudices come from, end quote. There's more than one we here. There's the we of the oppressors, of the oppressed, and of those in the gray zone between the two. So David, is belonging a matter of competing stories about, as you put it at the end of that reading, what happened?
Possibly, yeah. I think that is an interesting way to look at it. I guess the first thing that comes to mind in that question that you asked, competing we's, is one thing that I think a lot about when writing, which is the position from which I write. And this is one of the many things that I think that I have observed and am profoundly grateful for in reading Indigenous writers, Indigenous cultural workers of all forms, an ethics of locating oneself and explaining where you are coming from in presenting yourself and also looking at the world. I guess that has a really strong tradition, that self-location, positionality in Black writing, and that's the tradition that I write out of and that I'm most familiar with. And so you'll find people like Stuart Hall saying how important it is in cultural identity and diaspora, an essay that he wrote a while ago, how important self-location is and what the opportunity it offers to join a conversation with specific knowledge and specific insights. Likewise, the cultural critic Christina Sharp, in her very famous book, The Wake, says something very important about the personal and how it opens up an opportunity to counter the language of the violence of abstraction. When we think about political and social processes, I think oftentimes we're engaging in a violence of abstraction. We forget there is a disconnect from the intimate, everyday terms in which we live our lives, the quotidian, and how that quotidian opens up a perspective, a critical perspective on the biggest questions of where we are, where we've come from, and what the future can be. And so I guess just in general, if it's belonging in that first passage, it's my effort to communicate something to my daughter, who is living in a context in which she also will be seen in a particular way, and how and when, and sometimes that dreadful question, yeah, how and when to open up that conversation. Maybe the final thing, that's a very minor moment. And in the context of the world today, I think there's something that has to be kind of kept in mind. The minor moment that I experienced with my daughter, as difficult as it was, it's a very minor moment compared to the ongoing kind of violence that people live in this world, the emergencies like COVID that heighten and indicate who pays the price for global emergencies, who suffered the most. I guess my hope is that by looking deeply at one's own condition, riveting one's attention upon the everyday, there can be an opening up of a critical understanding about these broader questions, but only when there is both happen. I don't know if that's a good way to begin, but just a few things that came to my head with from your question.
There's so much of that narration about the we and the past also in your earlier book, Brother. And right at the end of that book, David, you say, this short book took me a long time to write. Why was that?
I guess because I think writing and forms of creative writing, although I would say that it extends to other forms of writing, particularly forms of experimental writing in criticism and theory. I've mentioned some people, Christina Sharp, Dion Brand, others who are doing, Sadea Hartman, people who are doing the type of writing that I really admire. There's a lot at stake in the how of writing. Writing for them is not simply this transparent medium in order to get to an issue or a question higher or more important.
Which is what academics do, right?
Right, I guess so. I mean, I think there are some academics who resist that, who push against that, and
Well, you're both.
well, I mean, I think some of the people that I just mentioned, Seda Hartman, Christina Sharp, these are academics, and they would understand themselves, both as as academics. And there's many others I can think of. But I guess in that attentiveness to what is possible in the language we use, the language we are forced to use, the language loaded with histories that are violent, encoded in the language itself. But if we can somehow work it closely and attend honestly to the lives around us, there are insights there that can be applied to the greater social problems besetting all of us. And so I think writing really does matter, and writing carefully really does matter. And that's why it takes me a long time. I can't speak to the effectiveness of my writing. I can't speak to what it does. What I can speak to is the seriousness with which I take the project of writing.
I think that comes through pretty clearly. Can I press you to do a bit of an extract from Brother to give us a sense of that struggle that you go through?
Sure.
And we'll have a quote on screen for you in a moment for the audience. So please go ahead, David.
Sure. So I guess I'll read from, this is from Brother, near the beginning of the book. Francis was my older brother. His was a name a toughened kid might boast of knowing, or a name a parent might pronounce in warning. But before all of this, he was the shoulder pressed against me, bare and warm, that body always just the skin away. Our mother had come from Trinidad, in what parents of her generation called the West Indies. It was a place that Francis and I, both born and raised here in Canada, had visited once and could vaguely recognize in words and sounds and tastes. I'm going to skip ahead. This is the but. In truth, none of us, not me, Francis, or Mother, had much interest in the gray pasts of photographs. We had more than enough to explore right here and now, and most of all, we had the running challenge of what our mother called opportunity. Mother worked as a cleaner in office buildings and malls and hospitals. She was also one of those Black mothers, unwilling to either seek or accept help from others, unwilling to suffer any small blow to her sense of independence or her vision of eventual arrival. And so, if a job suddenly arose in some distant part of the city, but held the promise of future opportunities, or if just as suddenly the opportunity for time and a half beckoned, she would accept the work, though it meant leaving her two young boys alone at home.
Thank you. Both the narrative and what the narrative talks about is so graphic about these gray pasts of photographs, which have to compete with the here and now in what you read to us. David, is this more about rejecting the particulars of a past, which complicates identity?
I wouldn't say that it's about the rejection of a past. I would say what the boys are attempting to do is affirm their existence and their life in the only context that they know, and that's a context that happens to be in Canada, in this suburb named Scarborough. And in a sense, I would say that maybe there's there's maybe some sort of, once again, I'm trying to rivet my attention upon the existential predicaments of the people I choose to write about. And these are two young Black boys in Scarborough, and that life. But I guess I'm maybe also being a bit polemical in a certain way, in the sense that oftentimes when I, as an academic, read about immigrant and the term post-immigrant, quote unquote, problems or challenges, there's this sense oftentimes of reverting to this logic that there is some sort of identity crisis that immigrants have. They're caught somehow between the old world and the new, and their challenge is to the question of quote unquote assimilation to the new. or the inability to leave behind the past or to accommodate oneself to the now. And in the lives that I decided to write about, I couldn't see a kind of a worse analysis of what their challenges are. That doesn't apply to the people that I'm writing about. The mother made a conscious decision to come to Canada, and she has these hopes attending that decision, and she wants to belong and participate in these other things.
Right.
There's no crisis there. She's fully aware, or she simply wants to survive. She simply wants a good life. I don't think she's thinking of in terms of cultural belonging. She just simply wants a good life for herself and for her children. Her children are likewise not dealing with some sort of conflicts of loyalties or a sense of cultural conflict. They have been brought up in Canada. It's the only thing they understand, which is also to say that the everyday prejudice they experience, the disparities, the poverty, etc., is Canadian, fully Canadian. They're dealing with Canada, and they themselves are trying to work out their existence within that framework. And so when they say through me to the speaker, we're not interested in the gray pasts of photographs, they're drawing our attention to the fact that they're dealing with here and now. That's their struggle. That's their predicament, and that's the predicament that they've been put in against their wishes. This is not to say there's something that I also explore in the story. This is not to say that the boys and their mother might not be able to draw from legacies of survival and struggle that cross borders, that come from, that have been nurtured and fought in the Caribbean, kind of circulate throughout the Black world, legacies of survival and struggle that they might look to. So maybe in those gray pasts and photographs, there might be things that they might draw from, legacies of, again, of struggle and beauty and persistence. But they understand that their struggle is here and now. They are what they are in this particular context, and that's what I've tried to write.
Right. But again, there is this tension in identity in your debut book, Soucouyant, where at the beginning you say, and there it is on the screen, mother was Black and father was South Asian. And though they met here, they both came from a place where there were serious misgivings about these peoples. Despite history and tradition, they had loved each other. Now, David, coming as I do from East Africa, I can attest to what you say about these mutual suspicions between ethnicities. But I sense a determined optimism in your narrative about how tradition and history don't have to be prisons in the present. Were you being symbolic there about your parents' love as standing for what society could also do about toxic histories and pasts?
I think so. I mean, as is probably apparent even in this conversation, I identify as Black, but I'm proud and open that my father is South Asian, particular kind of heritage as South Asian, Tamil speaking, they say darker skin Madrasi in the Caribbean. That's a specific kind of ethnic group, even among South Asians in the Caribbean. And I guess I hold out always this hope that among people of different backgrounds and experiences, and that includes racial backgrounds, there can be love, not to mention seeing, just simply learning how to see each other. Now, I don't think that happens automatically. I don't believe that. I don't believe that it just There's just a miracle of connection among people. I think we have to work for that. I think we have to learn to listen more deeply. I think we have to confront our own prejudices, our own lenses when attempting to see others. One of the challenges I think of seeing others and loving others is kind of the old tactics of colonialism, which is, to divide and conquer, to foment resentment and misgivings among disenfranchised peoples, and to set up hierarchies among those disenfranchised peoples arbitrarily, and again deliberately to perpetuate colonialism in different ways. But I really hold out the possibility that not simply only what we'd call maybe in Canada BIPOC people can have critical conversations, Black, Indigenous, people of color, that's what BIPOC means, might have crucial, precious conversations on a better way. But that all people, I don't, I think this is possible for all people who are willing to do the work, and willing to think through and enact different forms of relations, among others than the relations that we have inherited and that exist to this day. The final thing I would say is that one thing that I have been mindful of, and that I'm sometimes painfully mindful of in terms of my particular location, my particular heritages, is the sad, and for me it's just very disappointing, the presence of anti-Black racism, not only from white people or people who have learned to imagine themselves white, yes, but in non-white communities, Asian communities, Arab communities, South Asian communities, and so forth. And I think that's something that we who have connections to those communities really have to be on guard for, and to be prepared to call out. That's true allyship. That's true connection, when we're able to confront those hierarchies, that even among other, let's call them diasporic people or visible minorities, or to confront new forms of prejudice that may persist. Anti-Black racism is certainly there. Anti-Indigenous prejudice is certainly there as well too. And so that's something that I want to write, as well as love. That was, when you began with the characters in Soucouyant, this South Asian man from the Caribbean and this Black woman from the Caribbean, how in the space of Canada at that time, and now, Canada that wasn't prepared to see them and accept them, they found love amongst themselves. I hold out the possibility of that, but I think that can only happen when we look really closely and critically at the work that has to be done by all of us.
Well, moving on to this particular kind of belonging that we call citizenship, in your contribution to Narratives of Citizenship, which is a superb collection of essays I want to recommend to everyone on Indigenous and diasporic ways of belonging, mostly in Canada, you say, here's the quote, "We narrate not only our identities and practices as citizens, but also citizenship itself in ways that inevitably reflect our sidedness and desires. We often run the risk of narrating citizenship in ways that automatically figure Black people and non-whites in general as either passive or else outright worrisome inheritors of citizenship, and not active and at times crucial definers of it." Now, what I want to ask is, in this sense, in Brother as well as in I've Been Meaning to Tell You, by articulating what minority belonging means in Canada, is this what you're getting at also in your novels? In other words, Are your novels doing what your critique in this book was saying, that you're saying they matter to how we see citizenship?
I would, I see, I see where you're going with that, and that's, I see, yeah, I really do. I wonder if the way I put it right now, I wonder if this is a writer speaking or if this is not simply a writer speaking. But I guess, first of all, I don't see myself as being interested in minority belonging. That's not that's not how I see the work that I do. That seems to be I'm not sure what that is. I'm not sure. It seems a bit abstract to me. I'm not sure yeah, if that to me is an activating concept. I'm interested, I'm interested in, maybe to take off from what I've last described, I'm interested in the relations that we can now have with one another, and maybe even the natural world at this particular moment of crisis. What are
You
those?
mean regardless of minority and majority?
Um, I would say that again, I guess I'm interested in those relations, but with the understanding that we see very clearly where we are coming from. So what you might call minority belonging, I would call Black life. That's the way I would see it. I would say
Okay.
I'm coming at it from an attention to an experience of Black life. But I'm not interested in simply minority belonging. I'm interested in relationality with everyone, and really increasingly with beyond, you know, beyond the human world to the natural world. What are those relationships right now in this moment of all kinds of crisis? We need to now think of who are the voices, what insights can we draw upon when trying to think through those types of complex forms of relationality. So I guess I just wouldn't begin with minority belonging to try to address that. Black life, that is something that interests me. I mean, that to me, just because I think that is a massive, all-encompassing concept that presupposes an engagement with everything. It is not limited. It's not a kind of just a pocket concern. It is everything. That's the responsibility of thinking
Right.
through.
David, what about that other idea that you put out in that same essay, diasporic citizenship, which couples two hot button ideas, migration and citizenship? Is this another challenge to the nation state as making an exclusive claim to our belonging, rather like what you just said, environmental or cosmopolitan or Aboriginal citizenship?
So this is where I guess, I did try to think through this term citizenship in that essay, and with successfully or not, I'm not sure. One thing I can say right now, and it is in that essay, and is that I have great wariness around framing the work that I do and the work to be done by us in this moment of crisis through the lens of citizenship. And I guess it comes, I have to say that so this wariness about citizenship is not a dismissal of the fact that through my belonging to Canada, there are certain protections that I've been afforded, and it's not to undercut the fact that to be a refugee, to be quote unquote illegal, a ridiculous term, no one is illegal. To be without and undocumented in this world is to be in a condition of extreme precarity, and that we should be thinking about those people more and more now, this moment of global migrant crisis. But it is my wariness regarding that term as the term we should now latch upon. And I'm saying this, I am interested in people who talk about this term. I just have to say I am wary about it. And that wariness comes out of, I think, again, the Black intellectual tradition, where notions of citizenship and Black history where notions of citizenship were created in contexts where Black people were not citizens. And so that
Right.
profound contradiction at the heart of the ideal of citizenship is the fact that we can develop more and more fine-sounding notions of citizenship, but yet be comfortable with the fact that certain people do not actually have such citizenship, either in legal terms. It's very clear that in the past that Black people would not have that, or in systemic terms, so that yes, nominally an American, for instance, but actually not be safe from the powers of the state if they wish to take your life, not to have access to health care or to decent education the way other citizens are presumed to have access to. And so I think that tradition of being profoundly wary of that term citizenship, or at least understanding of the limits that Black life kind of expose regarding the ideal of citizenship, is the only way that I think I can begin to engage with that term citizenship. Another way to begin to, I think, unpack it, I would say another strong way would be, again, how that term, again, the conflict between that ideal and indigenous life. Likewise, I think there's a profound friction between the two that I can't speak to, but that's something that I would also be interested in learning more about. But regarding that contradiction of citizenship and Black history and the Black present, I would say that there's a real contradiction there that makes me unable to accept that term as the ground, upon which I will then do my work, do my thinking, my political work, never mind my work as a writer. The last thing I'll say, though, because I guess I was in that quote that you're suggesting, along with that historic exclusion of Black people from the notion and ideal of citizenship, is also this notion that that Black people either passively inherited this wonderful idea that others came up with, or they're another historical kind of sense. This lies that Black people have will compromise citizenship. This notion that that we have to be protective about our borders to many people, but I know of the histories of Black exclusion and how that is understood to threaten the citizenry. And what I find false about that is that it neglects how much Black people and their struggles, even when they're struggling for their own livelihoods, how often Black people have created the conditions for possible citizenship, have created the possibilities for expanded democracy. And this is not, again, it's just that people, it's not to say that that citizenship is, again, that's the frame in which I want to think of my work. That's not it at all. But I'm really struck by those contributions that Black people have made to deepening and more extensive protections and afforded by citizenship, and that are nevertheless not recognized. And so that's for me, that's something that I think people have to remember. I guess it's what some people have called Black gifts. Black gifts have been for all people if people kind of observe what those gifts have been, gifts of struggle and art, and an attention to a rewriting of the human condition by the very people who are excluded from that category.
David, you're certainly not alone in that suspicion about this idea of citizenship. And in my final question, I want to return to Arundhati Roy's 2020 Clark lecture, where she observes, quote, here it is on the screen, caste, this is in India, is the engine and the organizing principle that runs almost every aspect of modern Indian society. Yet so many celebrated writers, historians, philosophers, sociologists, and filmmakers have managed to produce a formidable body of work on India that either turns caste into a footnote or completely elides the issue. She calls that fake history, the great project of unseeing. David, this great project of unseeing, does this also apply to Canadian social history when it comes to First Nations, ethnocultural minorities? And do we use the term visible minorities in an ironic sense then? Because really they're unseen.
I think so in one sense. I mean, I obviously, although it's it's very possible that I've ancestrally I'm connected in intimate terms to the violence of caste. That could very well have been the terms kind of feeling that violence. One of the reasons why the ancestors on my father's side came to the Caribbean to seek some alternative to that. Possibly, I don't know. I do know for certain that in the Caribbean itself, they felt hierarchies. The quote unquote, Madrasi Indians, the darker skinned Tamil Indians in Trinidad itself were understood to be at the lowest of the rung among the hierarchy of South Asian desirables. And so I do know that's how some felt it. And I also know very well the history of representation around that. People like V.S. Naipaul and Harold Sunny Laddu, interesting writers in certain respects, but portrayed quote unquote Madrasi Indians in negative terms. So there's something that resonates, but I obviously can't speak to that painful history of violence around caste in India. Although I'm tempted to mention here that when I was reading a bit about that many years ago, I was struck by how Dalit people,
yes,
the misnomer,
the untouchables as they would call it.
Misnomer of untouchables, Dalit people who name themselves as the ground down. There was a moment in the 70s where they were attentive to the Black Power movement in the U.S. And there was a group of them that started calling themselves the Dalit Panthers. And again, it's a kind of an indication of how freedom movements, the Black radical tradition, I would say, has circulated throughout the world and has been a source of inspiration. And I myself would like to learn more about the violence of caste, maybe to be inspired by those freedom struggles, those struggles against violence, historical violence and oppression, and how that might enrich my own understanding of the world. But so, I'm going to continue to read more of Arundhati Roy on that subject and many others. Dr. Ambedkar, for instance, whose writings I found as a great Dalit leader profoundly interesting. There's Radio Sean. I thought it was on CBC that I listened to just recently about him and his extraordinary legacy. But as to the great legacy of unseeing, I think that's one thing. I think that's true in one respect, very powerfully true. But to kind of bring it full circle to the way I began, remember that woman in the grocery store? She didn't unsee me. She saw me. She noticed me. But she noticed me as someone who shouldn't be there, as someone undesirable, as as someone who couldn't have been born in Canada, whatever that means. I'm certainly not invested in who's.
But David, I think Roy would agree with you on that. It's not the great project of not seeing, but of unseeing what you do see.
Yeah, I think that might be a yeah, that I think that might be a better yeah, that would be a really great way of doing it. And it can be both. I think
Sure.
for me to say that it's a legacy of unseeing doesn't mean that doesn't contradict the fact that it is both. It is unseeing and unseeing a legacy of violence and unseeing a legacy of suffering, but also seeing in the sense that there are structures of identifying and confining particular people, attaching labels and conditions and whatnot to them, and limiting how they can be in a society. So it's also, I think, about seeing. So in a sense, we have to do both. Maybe we have to. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there, but
yeah, we could really labor this, but I think I want to bring Mark in to get a sense of how the audience is wanting to interface with us. So shall we get into the Q&A, Mark?
Yes. So yeah, we have 10 minutes left. Yeah, thank you everyone for your questions. I'll try and represent them. So the first question, I guess, goes back to David as a writer, and you mentioned at the top of this the Canadian canon. But there's a question about how David sees himself as part of the Trinidadian canon and the rich literature there, including C.L.R. James and V.S. Naipaul. How does he feel the weight of that?
Yeah, there are so many extraordinary writers that come out of that come from Trinidad or are connected to Trinidad, and so there's Derek Walcott is one of those major writers. V.S. Naipaul, for all the problems I have with V.S. Naipaul, at the same time he is an influence, and Dion Brand would be, I would say, the most kind of the most powerful and for me the greatest kind of aesthetic and deeper than aesthetic challenge to my writing, and that's because of a very particular poetic practice that she has been working on kind of steadily and succeeded in so many of her works are just profoundly important to me. So there is something there, and I think broadly, I think Caribbean writing has always interested me as well. I never feel really I've never felt weights in terms of people's legacies, or because I think I'm just doing something in my own space, and I think, I just humbly think that there are people that will that I'm connected to, and I want to read more of, and I've been grateful. There are people that have read my work, and that's sufficient. So I don't feel kind of a weight that of trying to measure myself against other writers and what they've been able to accomplish, or how their works have circulated in the world. I think my works, just very humbly, my works circulate in a way that I'm content about. And just to add to that, I know who I write. I know who I'm writing to, and I know where my writing comes from, and those are two really important things, even as I continue to be deeply grateful for all who find anything of interest in my writing.
By the way, on that interface between the Trinidadian canon and the Canadian canon, CBC Radio just did a 3-part ideas series on C.L.R. James.
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with commentary from Canadian West Indian academics and novelists and poets, and it was so powerful, and you could see the interface of the canons in ways which I thought were extraordinary in the work of James and the echoes today. So again, I think the globalization of the canon is fascinating here. Yeah?
I think so too. I mean, it's, you know, James's work is so important, but you know, where he sits is, of course, not only Trinidadian writing, not only Caribbean writing, but really it's the Black radical tradition, a very specific tradition of Black writing that
With Britain pulled in as well.
Pardon?
With Britain pulled in as well, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
for sure, for
the
sure.
colonial impact is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a global impact. And I guess what's kind of very interesting about that tradition, I mean, someone here might be Ronaldo Walcott, who has in fact, a book coming out soon, fitting squarely within that tradition. It is this deep critique, it's not an effort to accommodate oneself as Black people to existing structures, even existing liberal structures. It is an effort to rethink fundamentally the social structures that we have lived within, towards for all, with a kind of a firm, unwavering eye on justice. That's the Black radical tradition. It is to have that courage to think truly creatively about transforming the world for the better, for all who have historically been on the bottom, a just world. And so that's and that involves thinking very deeply about some of the things that we've often taken for granted about what people are owed, what people own, and such. The distribution of wealth in societies. That's the powerful thing about the Black radical tradition. That's what C.L.S. James, I think, exemplifies as others.
I want to try and squeeze in a couple more questions. So there's a group of questions which I guess are around the Indigenous experience. And I know you touched on that a couple of times in your conversation, but maybe it gives us a chance to acknowledge and speak to the Indigenous experience and what that means for the ability to say, I belong here, or where are you really from? I'll maybe leave it there. It's kind of vague, but maybe we could just comment on that.
I think that's an excellent question, and it speaks to my wariness around belonging and citizenship, and why I take my cues, from the Black tradition. I would say many of the writers that I'm most interested in the Black radical tradition, which is, it is not to, align oneself in naive ways with the nation state. The nation state being the thing that the source of so much displacement and suffering. And so the question, I guess the question for me is I think that's a really excellent question. My point in writing to my daughter is not simply to hope that she will find a sense of belonging here. My point is to draw her attention to legacies of struggle that have crossed borders and which have cited something more than belonging, more than insisting upon one's citizenship or simply directing one's attention only to fellow citizens. No, the goal is to draw attention to a legacy, and it's a legacy of Black struggle, but connected to other legacies of struggle, at least in my book. For instance, of South Asian migration, the legacies of indenture, that kind of speak to something more than that. But belonging is not the goal. Justice is the goal. Living in ethical relations with others is the goal. Remembering the struggles of those who came before us is the goal. And so I think that's an excellent question. Of course, I can't speak to deep in any deep ways to how to the, as you put it, the Indigenous experience. I simply have no way of, I just simply would want to just listen to Indigenous writers as they
Can we squeeze one more in, Mark?
No, I think we're at time now, so my apologies to for those of you who asked questions. Lots of intriguing and thoughtful questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I'll give it to you, Amin, to sum up the morning.
Okay, so we better close before the system shuts us down, yeah? So evidently the appropriate answer to where are you really from is, oh, that depends on what you mean by where, and you, and really, and from. Or you could just say here and there, which is also the title of our final event in this series, and Mark will tell you all about that in a moment. My deepest appreciation to you, David, for sharing this, your insights, your intuitions, your experience, and your wisdom. And to our audience for showing up on a sunny Vancouver day and beyond and joining us this time. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Amin. So if we could have this, thank you, the final slide. Just need to quickly thank the various bodies that have supported this series of talks, the Liberal Arts 55+ program of SFU, the SFU Centre for Comparative Muslim Studies, the SFU School for International Studies, the SFU Office of the Vice President External Relations, and the Ismaili Centre of Vancouver. As Amin said, please join us again on Saturday, March 13th at 11:30. Nazanin Hosar, novelist, will join us to talk about Here and There, The Pilgrim's Progress. So for details of that, please visit the website. You'll see it written there, sfu.ca/liberalarts. We also hope to post a recording of this event later in the week, if everything goes right, and you'll find that at that website too. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you David Chariandy, and thank you Amin. And enjoy the rest of your day.